evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 122 of the Retrospectors podcast, The Legend of Zelda. My name is Patrick Arthur, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, James Turlings. James, this is a big one. We don't actually usually play games quite this old. The only other NES games we've done, and I guess pre-1990 games we've done, are Castlevania and Mega Man 2. You picked The Legend of Zelda for this episode. Give us a little insight into why you picked this game and why you wanted to play it for the show.
Well, we did name our show Retrospective, so we should probably actually get around to playing a retro game at some point, right?
Yeah, instead of GameCube games all the time.
Yeah. But for real, though, I actually played Zelda a lot when I was growing up. Ocarina of Time was one of the first console games that I owned on the Nintendo 64. And it became one of my favorite games of all time, right up until I played FF10 and really loved that. So for a large part of my childhood, Ocarina of Time was my favorite game, and I played, quite a lot of the Zelda games since then, a lot of the, handheld titles and the later 3D, games and Breath of the Wild, etc. But I never actually went back to where it all began with the first game, which I am surprised about now that I think about it, because, it's been a series I've had a long history with. So I was really excited to go back and try this one. I heard from people that it was a bit obtuse in some ways, but I kind of was in for that, I tried as hard as I could to play through this game without a walkthrough. Failed miserably in the latter half of the game, but it was pretty fun and while it lasted.
I do think it's always interesting to go back to these games that were before our time, James, because the thing is, I think there's a tendency when shows like ours exist to go back to the games of our childhood, because those are the ones that shaped you. Those are the ones that you instinctively grasp the design principles of. So to go back past that point where our childhoods to games that were considered old at the time that we were born is always an interesting insight. In a lot of ways, we can be more objective because these games are well before the game design structures that are familiar to us. Unlike you, James, my familiarity with Legend of Zelda is like way less. I was never really a console player growing up, so all of these games kind of passed me by. I was, of course, familiar with Ocarina of Time. I had friends who had Nintendo 64s and it would come out for an hour every now and then, but it was never a game that really spoke to me on any level. The Zelda game that I've spent the most time with is Breath of the Wild, because that was, I have a Nintendo Switch. It was a chance to actually play it. In a lot of ways, I bounced off Breath of the Wild. Like, I didn't love that game nearly as much as people seemed to. And I thought there was something wrong with me. I couldn't quite understand why it was as widely beloved as it was. So I'm really excited you picked this one because it gives me an opportunity to experience the genre, and I guess you can call Zelda like a genre in a lot of ways, fresh, and maybe gain a deeper understanding as to why these games are so highly praised.
It's interesting. I know that they've stated that the design for Breath of the Wild came from kind of examining this original game a little bit, although now that I've played it, it almost feels like they took some of the wrong lessons in some ways. I'd actually be quite interested now, having played this, to play, maybe a more refined take on this formula, because while I've played other of the top-down games like Wind Waker and some of the Oracle games, I think the direction they took is a little different to the way this game works. I think you have a lot of freedom to move around in this game, whereas the later games, I think, kind of force a bit more linearity on the player.
Yeah, the 3D games and the 2D games seem to have pretty different design philosophies, despite ostensibly coming from the same place, don't they? Yeah. The other thing is that Breath of the Wild obviously doesn't have many dungeons, which is a peculiar choice.
Disappointing.
Well, yeah, I don't understand it, but that's the direction they went to, and they wanted to do a bunch of identical shrines instead. So who am I to criticize?
Well, now that I think about it, all the identical dungeons is pretty reminiscent of the first game.
Yeah, in some ways, I see what you're getting at.
Yeah.
So Zelda. So this is a game. It first released in 1986 in Japan for the Famicom. Released a year later in the United States. And Zelda is a top-down open world exploration action game. It's not really an RPG. You find items to power up your character as you go, but there are no stats to speak of. You're on a big open world. You explore the open world. You look for secrets. You find dungeons. Those dungeons have boss monsters and regular monsters and secrets and pieces of the Triforce. And the goal of the game is to assemble the Triforce so that you can go take on Ganon and win the game by rescuing Princess Zelda. I think I spoiled the story there, James.
Oh no.
Oh no. So I think that the best place to start with this is probably to talk about what our initial experiences were playing the game. Because Zelda is a game that just dumps you right in. You just get dumped straight into the game and you're there to start playing. So tell me a little bit about what it was like for you to start playing Zelda.
Well, I started my journey with this game by reading the manual, which I would recommend that every single person who plays this game should do that. It's quite long, it gives you a lot of information, and it actually gives you like an 80% completed world map, which playing without that, I just don't think is a good idea at all. The game world is generally, it's not huge. It's quite small, actually, but it's pretty easy to get lost because I think some of the transitions between screens aren't as obvious as they could be. You kind of are inside, I guess, rooms. Like the world map is divided into square rooms, and when you hit the edge of the screen, it will fully transition into the next room. And oftentimes, your environment will completely change. You'll go from a green forest to a rocky mountain, like within the space of one screen. So, yeah, definitely read the manual, get some tips on how to play, on how to win the game, on how to progress, and then start from there. I found the initial opening hours actually really fun, although a bit difficult to get my head around in some ways. I think the way Link controls is a bit janky. Like when you turn directions, it doesn't preserve where he's standing completely. You kind of shift left and right a little bit as you turn, which feels like kind of programming errors to me almost. So you kind of need to get used to that. But the controls are like dead simple, so it doesn't really take you too long to get a good grasp of it, I thought.
So it's interesting you say that. I found it a bit uncomfortable because there's literally zero momentum on your movement and there's no diagonal movement or input buffering, which are common features in modern games. Like modern games have figured out how to make characters feel more smooth to control.
Yeah.
But the control is very precise. Like you can get the character to do exactly what you want it to do. And I felt like the more I played, the better I got at moving around and dodging and moving precisely. So while it does feel a bit uncomfortable at first, it's not uncomfortable in a way that I would describe as janky. It's more just it has its own particular movement system. And I do think that it gives enough control to the player that there's nothing in this game that you can't really overcome with skillful movement. I think for most people, when they play through this game, no matter how good they are at movement, they will take damage occasionally. But you have such a big health buffer that taking damage occasionally isn't a huge issue.
So since I played Zeldas before, my first instinct was, well, get the sword, obviously, from the first room, and then go find the first dungeon, which the game gives you the map, which tells you exactly where it is. So I basically immediately went there. I was kind of like taken aback a little because I knew that Zelda 1 was the main inspiration for Binding of Isaac, which I've got like, 1,000 hours in or something. But it was like, this game's exactly the same was my first reaction in a lot of ways.
Yeah, me too. And this is the weird thing about coming to a classic like this from a modern perspective when I'm like insanely familiar and a massive fan of a game that has, I guess, ripped off Zelda in every possible way. Binding of Isaac has almost literally every single item and concept in this game in some form. So while I've never played one of these 2D Zelda games, it still felt very familiar based on it. So it's not just that some of the items are the same. Like there's a ladder that lets you traverse water or like an empty space. It's that the dungeon layouts that is basically what Binding of Isaac maps look like.
Yeah.
And the way that you traverse them is exactly the same as Binding of Isaac. So to some degree, unfortunately, my perception of this game is going to be forever colored by my hundreds of hours in Isaac.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually think that because I played Isaac, I had an easier game time with this game than I would have otherwise. Because unlike a lot of modern games, like Zelda basically doesn't hint at where secrets are, like visually. Well, it does, but they're quite subtle. Like, I think modern games, for example, if there's a wall you can break with a bomb, they'll show like a little crack or something. In Zelda 1, there's literally nothing other than maybe the dungeon layout implies there's a breakable wall here, or there's a block you can move here, that kind of thing. And I think secret hunting in Isaac for so long made it so I wasn't actually having that much difficulty finding which walls to bomb and which blocks to push, that kind of thing, which I appreciated greatly because I could see somebody with maybe less gaming experience really struggling to find out how to progress through some of these dungeons.
Yeah, so what did you think of the secret hunting on the whole, James? Because I found that I wasn't really a big fan of it. I think that the manual does a very good job at guiding you. In the manual, not only do you have the partial world map, which shows you the 4 dungeons, but there are tiles of the map which have question marks on them, which will guide you to secrets. But after I'd exhausted those secrets, the process of discovering secrets was so annoying to me that I didn't even bother trying.
I actually found it quite engaging. Like, there was something about the fact that the world is so open to you from the beginning. Like, you can go anywhere you want, and there's secrets in almost every room, basically. Like, there was this very natural feeling of exploration and secret finding where the game wasn't holding your hand. Like, it was quite liberating to me, having played lots of games that, do this thing in a bit more of a guided way. And that's not to say that, like, I think I agree with you that a lot of people are going to bounce off this and find it frustrating. For me, at least for the first 60% of the game, I found this was like my main motivation to keep playing the game because generally there were enough secrets in the game that I was finding stuff pretty regularly. There was a couple of issues I had with the secret system. The first one is that this isn't really maybe a negative, it's more of a thing the game's chosen to do, is that because lots of progression is semi-gated by secret finding, there's often redundant and duplicate secrets, like there'll be multiple shops behind hidden rooms that have the same item, just so it's likely you'll find one of them if you don't find both, you know what I mean? So you
Sometimes
don't
at
get...
different costs, though, right? I found
Yeah,
a shop where the items were cheaper than in other places, so it's not strictly identical.
yeah, so that still gives you value for finding the new one. While, the main benefit is that you don't have to hunt the map for hours trying to find this one specific one you missed. Sometimes. There was other cases in this game where that happened to me, where I was hunting for like an hour or two and couldn't find anything. That was probably more common towards the end of the game, because once you find like you've got like 80% of the secrets. The last few are so much harder to find, right?
Yeah, I guess I just can't really get on board with this idea that secret hunting is basically going to a room and then bombing all the walls or burning all the bushes. To me,
Yeah,
that process is not actually that fun, particularly when bombs are a resource that cost money or you have to kill
yeah.
enemies in order to get. That whole process isn't enjoyable. And I think that having a more robust and detailed clue system would have helped here.
There was some attempt at this, right? Like, there's lots of NPCs you can find that give you this cryptic clue that points you towards where a key item is or a location. I found a number that helped me find a lot of important secrets. Especially like the dungeons will be filled with NPCs that tell you where the sword upgrades are, for example,
Mm.
and that kind of thing. So, like, there was an attempt here. I do think it could use a lot of iteration, although I'm kind of sad that most games just do the whole, there's a crack in the wall thing and make it super obvious. I feel like there's a hint and you use that hint is more enjoyable, but at the same time, that thing you describe where you go around meticulously bombing each room one, like each wall one by one, is quite annoying.
But basically, what I'd say is that I think that the fact that the game directs you where the secrets are a good thing. The problem is when you get to the given room or screen, the process of trying to find that specific spot where the secret is not as fun. And I think that part of this is the fact that the overworld graphics are very limited in terms of creating a distinct space. So you'll have a mountain up the top, you'll have 7 bushes on the right, and you'll have a mountain on the bottom. You do feel obliged to bomb most of those walls where the mountain is, and you feel obliged to burn all the bushes where that are along there. You can imagine a modern equivalent of this game that has more finesse and specific detail in terms of its graphics would allow for more specific clues. So you could have a clue that points you to the tile left of a dragon statue because the graphics are diverse enough that you can actually get to that level of distinction. So I think that this game is not obtuse as its reputation seems to be, just because there are so many things pointing you in the right direction, particularly if you read the manual. But I still found that the process of trying to actually find it was frustrating to the point where in a lot of instances, I would just look up a walkthrough because I didn't want to bomb 20 tiles in a row.
Things like, I mean, if there was an item that beeped, if there was a secret in the room you're in, might help you, like, not have to bomb walls and rooms where there's nothing. Stuff like, I think some games in Zelda might do this thing where if you use your sword on the wall, it'll make a different sound when there's a hollow. Yeah, that kind of thing. Like,
That's a
all
great
that
idea.
sort of thing. Yeah, it doesn't change the fact that you have to do it along every single wall, like, but the cost of doing it is less, so you don't have to run out, get more bombs, come back, start doing it again, and it takes a lot, like, it's a lot quicker to do it. So I don't mind that. Like, I don't have a problem with secret walls in, like, Dark Souls, for example, even though it kind of encourages you to bonk lots of walls. But at this point, like in Elden Ring, there's just always a message that tells you where they are anyway. So
unfortunately, there's also 40 messages in front of non-secret walls, so you end up doing it a bunch anyway.
That's true.
It's funny you bring up Dark Souls because obviously Zelda was a huge reference point for Dark Souls in the same way that Dark Souls was a reference point for Breath of the Wild. And I can certainly see that inspiration, like the way you kind of get dumped into an area with multiple directions to go. But Dark Souls ends up being a lot more, I guess the specific paths that you go along end up being more linear and well crafted, whereas Zelda really does feel like a free for all from the very beginning. Like the 8 dungeons in the game can be done in almost any order, to my knowledge.
It's interesting to me. In the newer Zelda games, they have this thing where items kind of act as keys. Like, you literally cannot progress if you don't have this exact item. And there's like a couple of cases of that in this game. For example, one of the dungeons is hidden and the entrance is only revealed if you use a certain other item. That kind of thing becomes more common as the series goes on. Whereas in Zelda 1, something that I found was that lots of items had different uses, and a lot of those uses didn't like necessarily invalidate a specific enemy. They were just good against them. There was like they were more like soft keys that made exploring the world a little easier, but didn't like flick a switch most of the time and make, because it's actually quite hard to explore the map early on due to there's an enemy that appears in the water that shoots a projectile at you that does quite a lot of damage at the start of the game, right? And then once you get the upgraded shield, you can finally block those attacks. And then when you get the arrows, you can finally kill the enemy, which makes getting around a lot easier. But it wasn't like getting around was impossible, it was just harder and disincentivized, I guess.
I think that observation about the soft keys is an absolutely critical one, James. This isn't a Metroidvania, or at least
Mm,
it's not a Metroidvania in the same way that, Super Metroid or Castlevania Symphony of the Night is, where you kind of go along a path, find an item, and then that opens up new paths. I would say that generally what happens is you find items and you become stronger as a consequence because of either because you're literally becoming stronger or because they offer more utility to you. And that
yeah.
utility allows you to engage enemies in a more effective way, which then lets you tackle the more difficult areas of the game. And I really, really like this. Like,
Yep.
I love this concept because it's kind of a choose your own difficulty thing that's going on. You're not being barred from areas. It's more that you're being encouraged to get stronger before you return to areas and feel better equipped to deal with.
Yeah, but to me, it's good because it rewards player. Like, if you take the initiative and push yourself to go somewhere hard, you might get rewarded, maybe, or you've played the game before and you want to try a different route through the game. It sort of reminds me of the way the old Mega Man games work with the items. Like, the items
Yeah.
don't, yeah, they don't invalidate things, they just make like they give you good tools and options against certain enemies, right? Which lets you have this kind of freeform exploration and multiple routes or whatever based on your player skill.
And there are some very discrete upgrades. There's the sword upgrades which double your damage, and then there's the rings which halve your
Halve
damage
your
taken.
damage. Yeah.
Yeah, both of which are just absurdly powerful and completely change your experience going through. So I think that in some ways those items exist as gates to your progression just because it's
Yeah.
so much harder to get through the game without them. And naturally, there are whenever you beat a boss of a dungeon, you also get a health upgrade, which and increasing your effective health lets you survive, you know, two or three more hits than would otherwise be possible.
You go from taking like 6 hits, because you've got 3 hearts, and at the start you normally take half a point of damage, sometimes more. But then at the end of the game, if you have, is it like 12 or 20 ish? I don't know,
12.
around
I
there.
had about 12.
Yeah, 12 hearts, and you take a quarter damage or whatever. Sometimes damage doesn't even change the visual on the heart. You can take like 50 hits or something, right? And the later enemies in the game hit really hard. So you are sort of gated, but not like if you were a pro, you probably could do the last dungeon first if you weren't gated by items or whatever.
If you really wanted to.
Yeah, if you're a masochist.
Yeah. Yeah, so I have to say that I do like the progression structure of this game. Like Zelda is still an action game at heart, and that's what I like about it. As you move through the game, you're increasing your utility and getting different options to engage and attack with enemies as opposed to increasing your stats. When you do get the big stat upgrades, that is the sword upgrade and the defense upgrade, they do feel, in my mind, necessary for a first time player to
Yeah.
continue to engage with the content. But, if at level after the third or fourth dungeon, you get the upgraded sword, then after the fifth or sixth dungeon, you get the next upgraded sword. That it's kind of like a very linear progression in terms of power. And as long as you grab them at the right time, I don't think you're going to have any problems. I do think this is part of the game where having a walkthrough helps, though, because I can
Yeah.
imagine you're in a situation where you're going into the sixth or seventh dungeon and you haven't found that upgraded sword. I think you're going to have a significantly worse time. Like, it's going to be a less enjoyable game than if you get the upgrade that you're supposed to have gotten at that point.
I agree with that. And there's one thing about the progression gating that I thought was kind of interesting. So there's a number of items in shops that are prohibitively expensive at the start of the game. And, killing enemies, you'll get 1 rupee maybe every 2, 3 kills. And then in the third dungeon, I found these rooms filled with these little water elementals or whatever. and killing them gave me nothing. And then I found a hint to go and do this thing on the overworld. So I left the dungeon, went to that spot, got the upgraded sword, and then noticed that when I was killing those water elementals with the upgraded sword, they were dropping like 10 rupees every time. So I actually think the money you get is kind of gated by your weapon. Like they seem to drop different amounts based on what, you know, how far through the game you are.
I
So
hadn't clicked to that, but that actually makes a lot of sense. I found it easier to make money as I went through the game. James, tell me a little bit about like I know you seem from my conversations you've put a lot of effort into playing this game in a more old school way than I have. In a lot of ways, I was lazy. I consulted a walkthrough a decent amount in my playthrough, just because I wanted to get through the game and I didn't feel like wandering around aimlessly. But it seems like you've approached this far more in the spirit of what it was intended. I know that you filled in a map. Were you writing notes on the map for like the locations of the shopkeepers or potential secrets, things like that as
yeah, I
well?
did that. I basically what I did was I was playing on my PC through an emulator, and I every time I got to a room that I hadn't mapped out, I just took a screenshot of the room and pasted it. Like I had the game's manual map open in Paint, basically, and was just pasting the rooms onto each unexplored square. And then if I found a bombed wall or something, I'd mark it. But yeah, I found that kind of fun actually, like finally getting to the end of it. Honestly, I think my biggest problem with the overworld exploration is that I think the bombs should have a bigger radius for blowing up doors because
Hmm.
after I beat the game, I looked up where all the secrets were, and I was like, I have bombed that spot like 6 times. Like, I know I've checked that spot, right? Like, I've on my map, I have marked where I've bombed so I don't do it twice. And all of the ones I missed must have been like a pixel off where I was bombing.
Bombing is also, it feels a little imprecise compared to Isaac because instead of dropping the bomb on top of yourself, you drop it in front of
A little
yourself.
front,
Yeah,
yeah.
and it's like a little bit in front, so it's easier to mess up. That does make them easier to use as a combat tool, but it does
Yep.
make them harder to use as a precision secret finding tool.
Yeah, so I got to about level 7 or something before I needed a walkthrough, and at that point I needed it quite a bit. So I know there's an item in the game that's like a skeleton key, it's a key for every door. Keys in this game are interesting because in other Zelda games, keys are per dungeon. Like keys from one dungeon don't help in a different dungeon, but here you can find excess keys in a dungeon and then use those keys in the next
You can
one.
buy them shops as well.
Yeah, you can buy them from shops. I didn't find the skeleton key, and in the last dungeon, I got myself into a situation where I was in a bunch of rooms where all the doors were shut, and there were no secret exits, and only way to get out was keys. So I had no choice
It,
other than to die.
so you could die at least. It wasn't a true soft.
Yeah, but I was on full health. It took like 5 minutes to die because enemies do so little damage at that
We
point.
should talk about how death works in this game as well. There's not really a massive punishment for death in this game. I was actually quite surprised at it. You lose your progress for wherever you are, but you keep all of the items and rupees, and you just respawn back at the starting location. And the starting location is never too far away from where you need to go because the map's not too big.
You do only start with 3 HP though, so
Which is
one
annoying
thing
because it feels you have to grind that up in a lot of situations.
you can go to the fairy fountain, but it's important in this game to keep your health up, right? Because when you're at full health in this game, your sword shoots a laser beam that explodes, which is massively important for combat. But if you're at 99% HP, you won't fire that beam. So I found as the game went on, it actually got harder to stay at full health because it just took more hearts to top you up. So I actually found death to be more punishing as the game went on, and I found myself more and more just leaving the dungeon, going to the spring, coming back, or buying some potions or something
So
to.
this is where I was a bit cheeky. I was creating save states at the beginning of each dungeon. So
Yep.
I didn't use saves mid dungeon, but I did go like, I'm just going to create a save state at the start of this dungeon. So if I get wiped, I don't have to go through that process of getting all my health back to full. I'll just do it once and then I'm set until I can.
The thing I used save states for was there's those teleport stairs that you can find. I would, and like when you walk in, the dude talks really slow, so I just like save, and because I'd forget which one was which. Should we do a music break?
We should. Then we can get more into the dungeons and specifics of
and the combat.
Yeah.
Okay, so this game has 3 songs. Like, there's the title theme as well, and the end credits theme, and some of the like little jingles when you get items. But for the most part, like 90% of the game, there's 2 songs, and then in the final dungeon, there's 1 new song. I like the main Zelda theme, but it got pretty grating after a while, I have to admit.
I kind of was okay with it, which is crazy because I understand that you'd find it grating, but this music's just excellent. It feels almost redundant to say that, like, this is one of the most iconic themes in video gaming history. Even the dungeon theme and the Mount Doom theme, Death Mountain theme are iconic themes. They're all good. I love them. I liked the dungeon theme a bit more than the overworld theme, but it's really hard to criticize this music. It's just excellent. I would say that of these NES games that we've done, I think both Castlevania's and Mega Man soundtracks are better just because they're more diverse. And I think that the best songs on both those soundtracks are better than Zelda's, but it's still great music. I think it perfectly encapsulates the feeling of adventure.
I agree. One thing I wanted to mention on sound design is that something that has changed a lot over the past, 30, 40 years or whatever of game design, is that in menus, it's very often that when you change like where your cursor is, that there'll be a sound that plays.
A ding. Clink. I'm thinking it would be a clinky sound, like a high pitched.
Yeah, I think older games tend to use a really high-pitched and shrill noise for this. Like Zelda 1 definitely does that. It's very, like, if you cycle through lots of items, it starts to get a bit grating. Modern games actually use a much lower tone, generally, like a little donk or clicking sound that's like quieter and not so grating on your ear.
Yeah, Dark Souls and Elden Ring use that like very low bassy sort of like thumping sound, don't they?
Yeah. Which I actually noticed this quite a lot because you have to scroll through menus a lot in this game to change your item. Newer Zelda games let you bind generally like 3 items at once, so you can, avoid doing this constantly. But I was doing this like twice a room in some rooms, especially when you've got things like the candle which turns the light on. So, little bit of a gripe there, but it's not really a big deal in the long run. So let's go with the main theme. It's the most iconic. So this is the main theme for Legend of Zelda. Alrighty, so let's talk a bit about dungeon design and combat. How did you feel about, let's start with the enemies, Patrick. How did you feel about how they were designed compared to like maybe a more modern game?
So once again, the thing that really stood out as being quite funny is that a lot of these enemies are replicated in Binding of Isaac.
Yeah.
Maybe not in exactly the same way, but it's impossible for me to play through this game and not think, oh, that's that Binding of Isaac enemy. Oh, that's that Isaac enemy. In general, I think they were good. Like, I think that I found the combat and engagement with enemies in this game quite enjoyable. One of my critiques of Castlevania when we played it is that I think in a lot of instances you had enemies that didn't feel like they meshed up particularly well to your movement capabilities. Things like the enemies that would come from the bottom or top of the screen and would
Mm.
require weird backstepping maneuvers in order to get a good angle on them, because of the specific way you attack and move. Zelda, I pretty much never felt like that. I always felt like it was within my, if I played skillfully enough, that I would be able to maneuver around these enemies and their peculiarities and defeat them, provided I did the right thing at the right time. The only thing about them that was a bit odd is that the enemy
That
AI,
AI,
yeah,
it's
felt
quite bad, I think.
well, it felt unpredictable, and I don't know if it's truly unpredictable or if it
Yeah.
was just hard for me to wrap my head around. But there were a lot of instances where I thought I'd be able to get a safe attack, and then they'd spin on a dime and they'd hit me, and I'd be like, I don't quite know why they did that.
Yeah, there's two enemies in particular who I think are the most egregious examples of this. So there's the blue Wizrobes, which I hate these enemies. Like, I hate fighting these.
So
They have,
they're an enemy that teleports, but those are the ones that also move around, right?
yeah, so there's the orange Wizrobes, who I actually think is the most well-designed enemy in the game. They teleport to a spot, and then wherever you are in relation to them, they will fire a projectile in the closest of the four cardinal directions to you. So if they teleport to the right of you, and then you immediately move down, they will shoot left, and you can hit them from below. The blue Wizrobes run around and then will unpredictably fire their projectile at you, and sometimes they will go super fast and boost to you, which I found to be like, this would be less hard to deal with if I had a ranged weapon that worked against them, but I think they're immune to all of your items, which I found really unfun
Can
and
you
kind of.
boomerang them to stun them?
No, I don't think so. I tried. I don't. You don't think you can really do that with them or the knights that you can only attack from behind.
Yeah.
Although I think maybe the wand, once you can shoot fire, might be useful against those. But yeah, in general, pairing this unpredictable movement with a combat, like a primarily melee combat system, is really frustrating. You mentioned that these same enemies exist in Isaac, and I agree. And it strikes me as obvious now that they're much less frustrating to fight if you have a ranged attack as your default weapon, because their unpredictable movement is less likely just to clip you, because they won't turn on a dime and smack you, because you're right up in them trying to hit them.
Well, the Isaac enemies are also that AI is far more predictable. They'll more
Yeah.
aggressively come after you, or they have set behaviors. Like, there's an equivalent of
Well, the orange Wizrobe has a very predictable way of attacking and moving, which I
which are the
liked
ghosts
about it.
in Isaac.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
But
I
also the knights, like the knights, you have these enemies in Isaac which have masks on their front, and you attack them from the back. But the idea is that if you stand in front of them, they charge in a straight line towards you, and you have time to maneuver behind them, right? Whereas
yeah.
when I tried to do that with these enemies in Zelda, they would often just turn around again as soon as I got behind them. But I was able to, if you attack them from the side, that ends up being pretty effective.
Pretty good. Yeah.
Except there's one room with like 8 of them in it. I was like, what the fuck am I even meant to do here?
I really enjoyed this game a lot less towards the end of the game, because it was pretty relentless at spamming these two enemy types, and I found them kind of tedious. Like, I don't actually mind the design of the knights, but I think rooms that have like 10 of them are so unfun. It takes so long to get through, and it's like so tedious.
The best rooms are the ones that mix them. Like if you have a room with two knights, two whiz robes, and then two of another enemy, it
Yeah,
feel like the combat has this very dynamic, fun feeling to it. When there are so many enemies, it can, I don't know. For me, I found it overwhelming. Like I didn't have a clear way to actually start taking them down. So I would either use a bomb or I would just take damage in the process of whittling them down to a point where I can manage it, which didn't feel as good.
yeah, I agree. So I think in general, I would say the enemy design is like surprisingly good for the time. But there are some pretty like obvious flaws with it that kind of cap how fun it can be towards the later half in the game. Like there are some really good chaotic rooms that have a bunch of different enemy types, and there are some absolutely heinous rooms that have like the worst possible mix of enemies that are like it's no longer fun and rewarding, it's just annoying. I don't know. I am very on the fence about how I feel about the combat. It's like good and bad. The worst thing to me is that items stop being useful against enemies later on. Like I can understand the boomerang stopping working because it's kind of overpowered at the start of the
Dude, I
game.
love the boomerang. It's my favorite
Yeah,
item in the game by far. The thing about Isaac is that the ranged attack can lead to situations where where the combat isn't engaging because you can kind of just play
yeah,
stay away from the enemy and move around in circles. Melee combat requires you to play fundamentally more riskily because you have to get in closer to the enemies. And the
yeah.
boomerang is an awesome tool to mitigate a lot of that risk because they're only stunned for a temporary amount of time. So being able to boomerang and then try to get into flank it's very satisfying. I really enjoyed that style of combat.
So I actually think that like I would love to play another game like this with this combat system, but more modern.
I'm sure you have. Like that must. I mean, I guess you could say in a lot of ways, all isometric action games have come from Zelda in some way, right? Like,
Yeah,
is Diablo a Zelda clone?
it's different, right? Because this game has this directional blocking thing, like where you're always blocking unless you're attacking. There's like yeah, and the items kind of like they've got that Mega Man thing where they're good against certain enemies. Like I think this specific combination of ideas is really cool, and it's not super common, honestly.
I bet there's like a super obvious example of a game that does this that you and I are just not thinking of.
Like the rest of the Zelda games.
Yeah, I don't know, Crystallis.
uh,
Maybe what's that? Is the YS game?
yeah, that's not a bad example. That game, like when we did Oath of Felghana, it was sick.
Yeah, like
Really
the
enjoyed
combat
it.
in that game, like specifically the boss fights, was very good, and it had that going on, right? But I agree with you. Like I'm struggling to think of like a direct equivalent to this kind of tightness of movement. Uh,
Mm,
it's yeah, maybe Smash TV. I don't know.
yeah, there'll be something. I'd like to find it and play it.
I'm sure it exists. I'm sure. Binding of Isaac. There we go. We figured it
Yeah, there
out.
we go. We found it.
What did you think of the boss fights, James?
Pretty bad, honestly. Like compared to modern boss fights, like some of them are kind of cool. Like I didn't mind the many-headed dragon once you like got good at dodging its attacks. I think Ganon's pretty shit, honestly.
Agreed.
Like having this invisible, like you're just running around trying to find where he is kind of boring.
What did you think
Pretty.
of the enemy that was like it had like four spikes coming out around a central thing, and you had to kill each of the
That was one
spikes?
of the better ones for sure, and it
Dude,
got
that
faster and
thing
faster.
fucked me up multiple times. Like it when it doesn't have many appendages, it starts blitzing around the room super fast.
Yeah.
And there's a room in one of the later dungeons that has four fireball statues in the corner.
As
Just
well as those. Yeah.
yeah, I went
So
from full
hard.
health to zero on that room. Like I was like, what the hell? And
What
then
the
I
fuck?
realized you could bomb it, and it became
A lot easier. Yeah. Mm. I found Dodongo to be kind of hit or miss about whether the bomb affected it or not. The little dinosaur that was the first boss in this. Well, there was the boss of the second
oh
dungeon.
yeah, You have to make it swallow it. It's like the
But sometimes it swallowed it and didn't get like vulnerable. It just kept walking.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe
It worked for me.
yeah. Well, because I knew about that because the boss in the second dungeon in Ocarina of Time's a Dodongo, and you just throw bombs in its mouth.
Ah, right. There's a room with like three of them in it, and I didn't have enough bombs, and I was like, cool design game, cool design.
Yeah. I actually found that most of the dungeons, one thing that I thought was cool was that generally when there was a critical hidden door or an enemy that required bombs, the game usually dropped bombs for you in a room just before it,
Yes, that is true.
which kind of tips you off that there's either something that needs the bomb or a secret door that you should look for, that kind of thing, which I thought was pretty good signposting. Yeah, in general, I mostly liked the dungeon design. I liked how actually they felt like labyrinths that were like proper mazes and not like actually a linear progression that's just like pretends to look like a maze. Maybe I'm just too like used to the classic Zelda, like the new Zelda formula, where you just like follow the path and oh, you get this key, but then the path takes you to the place where you use the key. It's kind of cool that in this game, any key is really for any door, whereas in New Zelda, you'll get one key at a time and there'll only ever be one door you can use it on. So, like, what's the point?
So I found the dungeons like firstly, let me just say the dungeons are my favorite part of this game. Like all of the overworld stuff is less enjoyable to me because of
Agreed.
its general obtuseness. Not that a bit of obtuseness is bad. It's just that the process of figuring that out, I didn't find particularly fun. When I was in the dungeons engaging with the moment to moment gameplay, when it was good, it was very enjoyable and it was very good. Where I would say that it feels a bit weak is that the flow and progression through the dungeons, it's not random, but it does feel imbalanced and imprecise in a way that I think that a modern take wouldn't. You often have like these super easy rooms wedged in between difficult rooms. And sometimes you'll have like three randomly easy rooms in a row. I think the early dungeons are perhaps they don't ramp up in difficulty fast enough, and then dungeons 5 and 6 are a dramatic step up in difficulty. Um, and I think that these dungeons are probably a bit too small. The final dungeon is absolutely massive. Like it's probably 4 times the size of the next largest dungeon. Uh, but the earlier ones are, only 20 to 25 rooms, where I think that they could have ramped them up to 30 to 40 rooms pretty easily. It meant that my progress through these dungeons in a lot of cases felt kind of yeah, imbalance is probably the best word for it because it didn't feel like they were handcrafted in the same way that a modern dungeon would be.
Yeah, one thing that I sort of liked about them is that because the layouts, like the visual design, was so plain in each of them, like every dungeon is the same but a different color. They don't actually guide you that much, like visually compared to newer games, which I get that a lot of people will be listening to me say this and be like, that's a good thing that new games do that. And I agree mostly, but for me, it being more maze-like makes the exploration more fun for me. And actually, I kind of disagree about the size because I think this design where you have a lot of secret walls actually works a bit better in smaller dungeons. Once they get too
Hmm,
big, it becomes like a gargantuan task to meticulously check every wall,
that's a
which
good point.
becomes more tedious than fun. When it's smaller, this kind of thing works a little better, I think.
Yeah, it was more that like the way I explored these dungeons is that I went to every single room. Like I wasn't just because I wanted to exhaust everything, and I knew that after playing, I knew that there would be critical items potentially to progress through the game or to defeat the boss
That's kind
in
of
every
how I
single room.
explore in Isaac too, honestly. Like I go through every single room on the floor to maximize what I get out
Yes.
of it.
Unless
Yeah.
you're trying to speed run it and try and get that kill in under 20 minutes, yes, that is absolutely what you should be doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's the same, right? what I mean is like, are you criticizing Zelda for doing this while
No, no, no.
enjoying it in Isaac? Okay.
No, I'm not saying it's a bad thing I explored them, but if you look at Isaac, for example, the size of its dungeons
Are a bit
escalates.
bigger, yeah.
They get bigger and bigger until when you get to like the womb, for example, is bigger than the previous floor. So you have like these 6 to 7 iterations until you get to the delirium floor, which is basically the size of Ganon's dungeon, right?
Yeah.
But there's a more of a gentle escalation. With this, it feels like the dungeon's got a little bit bigger. Then all of a sudden, you get one that's absolutely enormous. So I think that they could have escalated more as you played through the game.
Interesting. I think one of the like to me, making the dungeons big is less enjoyable because each dungeon introduces a new like enemy type, basically, or a new item, and there are only so many new configurations of enemies that the game can throw at you with the enemies that it introduces. So I think when the dungeon gets too big, you end up having rooms with basically repeated encounter design as you go through.
Mm.
Um, and also, there's less stuff to find in Zelda, so exploring is less rewarding and inherently less enjoyable in some ways. So, yeah, to me, more tighter dungeons with more like if the difficulty ramped up a bit faster and they throwed more interesting configurations of enemies at you more consistently, to me would be more ideal.
I guess that's where I'd point out where I feel like this is what I mean by imprecise. You'll be going through a dungeon and there'll be a room with 8 bats, and then there'll be a room with 5 slimes. And these rooms, even when you're at your weakest, are just complete
Base
gimmies. Like
rolls. Yeah.
they're nothing rooms in a lot of ways,
They
right?
kind of just exist to drop health for you.
Yeah, and having those in the first couple of dungeons is fine, right? Because you would expect those to be easier. But even as you're moving into these later dungeons, you will still encounter rooms that are kind of like this. And I think that more could have been done to have more precisely crafted challenges. Like instead of having a room with 8 knights or whatever, you could have had 2 wizrobes and 2 knights at an earlier dungeon, right? Which would have still
Yeah.
provided an engaging challenge without it feeling, I don't know, just like it's spamming enemies at you.
Yeah, those rooms with, to me personally, if those rooms with like 8 slimes or 8 bats were just a room with hearts and rupees and no enemies, like that would be effectively the same thing, but less time wasted and more like it would make the progression more standard. Because you could go through those 8 bats and not get anything. Although I think for some players, that like rest to be able to just swing your sword and kill 8 things is kind of important, for feeling like you're still strong.
Isaac will do things where he'll have rooms that basically have resources in them, and you have to expend an item to get a resource. So you could have had rooms that were like, oh, if you expend a bomb, you can get this health item, right? Things like that to break it up as opposed to having just a bunch of enemies, low tier enemies.
And the future Zelda games introduce puzzle rooms, right? Like this
Yes.
game didn't really have puzzle rooms at all. I was actually kind of surprised about that. The puzzles are just a constant thing in terms of finding breakable doors and rocks, but there's no like handcrafted pushing blocks or using an item on a switch to light this torch and all that kind of
Yeah,
stuff.
the lack of pushing blocks is shocking, actually. I was sure there'd be pushing blocks onto switches.
Yeah, stuff like that. I was like kind of surprised, because I think that's a better way to give you this like, there's a period of high intensity action and then there's like a bit where you take a break and you think a bit to solve a puzzle that's not too hard but hard enough to be engaging. Repeat.
What did you think of the final dungeon, James? Because I was saying before, this literally took me 2 hours to get through. It absolutely kicked my ass.
After I got soft locked, I got so salty I looked up a walkthrough for the rest of it. I was so annoyed. Like I'd spent like a couple hours trying to get through it, and then after that I was like, fuck this.
Yeah, I think the
But that's
skeleton
kind of,
key
yeah.
makes a big difference, right?
Yeah, it does. So that might be my problem, but it's like definitely an item you can miss. So I don't know. I thought it was okay. I liked the enemy that was just the one with the circling flies around it.
Oh yeah, that
It's
enemy was tough.
was like, that's cool. I'm glad they introduced new enemies in this last room.
In general, the rooms I found the toughest were definitely the ones with the statues that shot fireballs at you. I found those really hectic to try and dodge in between trying to keep track of enemies.
Yeah, to me, it was the ones that had the slimes that eat your shield, the spinning invulnerable things that eat
Yeah.
your sword, blue wizrobes, orange wizrobes, and like one other thing.
I
Like
think there
those
was
are
a room
just
with like all of those or
there's
most of
just
those.
so chaotic.
Yeah.
And when you have lots of enemies that all have unpredictable movement, like you're gonna take so much like almost unavoidable damage just because like you'll be put in a spot where you're like, I think I'm safe, and then something darts over to you unpredictably. Very frustrating.
I do think, like, to drill down more specifically, I think one of the things that's fun about this game is that you can only attack in the direction you're facing. So to some degree, in these more chaotic rooms, you have to make a decision between dodging and kind of like looking for opportunities to get attacks in.
Mm,
There was one early room which had four fireball spitting statues and three guys with boomerang enemies,
yeah.
and that killed me, no joke, like 6 or 7 times because it was very difficult for me. Like I didn't have much health at that point. I wasn't doing much damage, and I wasn't very good at the. I hadn't quite mastered the movement, but as I learned to play with patience, I learned to dodge first and then look for opportunities to do damage second. And when I finally beat that room, I felt an enormous sense of accomplishment. I was like, okay, like I've earned this victory over these enemies. But as you said, James, like when you have these rooms that just have so much going on, I never got to a stage where I was like, yes, I've earned that victory. It was I threw a couple of bombs down and kind of traded damage for getting hit until it got to a point where I could read them.
Yeah, I like the combat in general. I think there's a lot going well for it. I think it's critically reliant on the enemy design because it's quite like what you can do is a bit limited, but your items kind of give you options.
And you can definitely see how this can be refined and has been refined in further action RPGs, with enemies that have clear telegraphs for the attacks
Yep.
they're doing and the movement they're doing.
And much better boss fights.
Even Chrysalis shows that you can do better boss fights. I mean, the boss fights in Chrysalis were easily the best part of that game.
Yeah, other than the times where you got there and you couldn't do damage to them. Yeah.
Great design.
Yeah. So I'm positive on the combat and the dungeons and the secrets generally. I think that where the game mostly falls short is towards the latter half of the game. There's just some frustrating elements that could have been shaved off a little. But it's like for a game that came out in 1986, I'm like kind of impressed in some ways.
Me too. Do you want to move on to final impressions, James, or are there other things you'd like to talk about?
No, I think we pretty much covered it. There's not a lot to this one, so I'll just go first. I would recommend Legend of Zelda, actually. Like, I don't necessarily think that I would recommend entirely finishing the game, but this is a really interesting case study of a game doing a lot of cool, disparate things that come together to make a fairly enjoyable final product. And there's lots of elements that, like, I think have been lost in the later Zelda titles, like this concept of soft keys, the way that your character gets stronger without feeling railroaded through the progression like in the newer games. Like this freedom of exploration is super cool. I like how different this system of secret finding is compared to more modern titles, although I think there are some improvements to be had. There's just a bunch of directional things here that I think have been lost to time as the series has gone on. So, I would love to play an alt timeline Zelda series that took some of these other ideas that kind of got discarded because I think it's really cool. I didn't love my entire time with this game. Like the ending, I was pretty miserable, honestly. But the first, 60-70%, I was having a great time. Like I plowed through this game in like a couple of hours in the first 2 days of the 3 weeks, and then the slog at the end was kind of a bit miserable for me. So overall, would recommend, but once you start getting to that point where you're no longer having fun, it's probably a good time to put it down.
So for me, this is a soft recommend in the vein of soft keys. I basically recommend this game on the proviso that you have a walkthrough handy. I think that a walkthrough basically will mitigate the most frustrating and annoying parts of this game, while still allowing you to engage with the most enjoyable parts of this game, which is the combat and dungeon progression. That doesn't mean like have a walkthrough open and do step 1 through 25. It's more that you play the game, and then when you get to a point where you're like, what the hell do I do? Instead of spending a long time trying to figure it out, just guilt-free open a walkthrough to give you a nudge in the right direction. I think that if you always do this and have a willingness to do this, you get to engage more with the most fun part of the game. I do understand that that does take away from an important part of the experience here, that is the secret hunting. I just think that on balance, it's basically better to skip that part of the game just because, for me at least, I didn't find it that fun. I will say that using the manual before resorting to a walkthrough is probably a good idea. So let me amend that. You should play the game. When you get stuck, look at the manual and use that as a way to guide you. And after that, if you still can't figure out what to do, just pop open a walkthrough so that you can progress through the game. I think that as long as you follow this creed, then I can easily recommend Zelda. It's a pretty fun game. And I think that the tightness of its controls and its combat, its moment-to-moment gameplay, makes it an enjoyable game overall. So Zelda was a good game, and I'm actually really keen to try A Link to the Past or Link's Awakening. I don't know what order all these 2D Zelda games came out, but I'm interested to try one of the newer ones. I say newer as in newer than 1986, to see the ways they've refined what is here, because the basic stuff that's here is pretty damn good. So it was a good game, and I enjoyed it. I'm glad you chose it, James.
Most of my enjoyment, I think, comes from a like we review these games from a modern perspective, but I had a lot of enjoyment from a historical point of view from this one, and it's hard to hide that. Like, there's a lot of this game is very influential to the way video games evolved in the next 10 or 20 years after it came out. So, it's like super interesting. We're definitely going to play another Zelda game too. I think Link to the Past is probably the one we'll go with, A Link's Awakening. Link to the Past is the one that people say is the best of the old 2D Zeldas. We're going to skip Zelda 2 probably. I don't hear good things about that one.
It's a different kind of game.
And it's basically, not the same game. So we'll see.
The thing is, I think that of the NES games we've played, this is the best. Like, I think this is better than Castlevania and Mega Man 2.
Better than Crystalis?
Yes. Yes, it is better than Crystalis. Except for the boss battles. Crystalis has that going.
Yeah, it was better.
So that's it. That's Zelda, or The Legend of Zelda. Thank you so much for listening to us. I think I forgot to mention at the start of the episode, but if you've been with us this far, James and I are the Retrospectors podcast. Each and every episode, we review classic games from a modern perspective. You'll find all of our content on our website, which is rspodcast.net. We've also got a link on our website to our Discord server where you can suggest games and give your opinions on our opinions. So we would love if you would drop by and say hello. That's it, James. What are we doing?
What are we doing next? Yeah, this is your choice, right? Why are you asking me?
I don't know why, James. I'm lost. So the game that we are doing next episode is a game that I've wanted to do for a while. We are returning to survival horror and doing Resident Evil 2, the original.
I gotta be honest, I heard the S and was like, we are doing a stealth. But Resi 2, the original one, we didn't do the original Resident Evil 1. We played Remake, which is, I think it's not a stretch to say, the favorite game of both of us from the whole show that we've done. Like, it's pretty easily up there, top two.
It was amazing because I wasn't expecting it as well to love it as much as I'd done. Like, the only other survival horror game I'd played before that was Silent Hill 2, which I had very mixed feelings about. So Resident Evil just completely blew me away at just how insanely good that game was.
Yeah, and I know people love the remake of 2, but I think, yeah, it'd be more interesting to go back and do the original 2, having done, remake of 1. I think it'll be interesting because we've done 4 as well, but that
It's a
game,
different kind of game.
it's basically an action game, right? Like, yeah.
For those who haven't listened, our conclusion mostly is that Resi 4 is a tactical shooter. It's not a survival game. It's barely a horror
It's
game.
a good tactical shooter, like
It's
a
a
really
great
good
tactical
one.
shooter. It's
Yeah.
a fantastic tactical shooter, but it completely eschews the survival elements with its stupid fucking adaptive difficulty, which I will never get behind as a good mechanic.
Yeah. It's probably like it's one of those mechanics that are like it's probably a good business decision to include this to get lots of sales from lots of people who will have a better time with the game. But for me, personally, I hate it. I
Well,
want the real challenge of the resource management.
Well, it basically smooths out the experience, right? Like it gives you a less uneven experience. But the truth is, uneven, imbalanced experiences are amazing.
Sometimes, like with Zelda, I think it wasn't always, the best when it was uneven. Like,
But basically, it's not fun in the moment. But when you look back at the experience as the whole, it creates a wider range of experiences than a smoother one. Like the example I always give is XCOM 2 War of the Chosen. Basically, you can be mid mission and you can have one of the Chosen, which is basically a super powerful boss monster, just invade you at any time. And it can screw you up big time because you're not expecting it and you're not ready for it, and you lose some of your critical troops and have to figure out how to mitigate the damage to the best of your ability. So it's unfair, but it produces a unique experience that you have to deal with to the best of your ability, right?
I would describe those things as high variance. They can give you some of the best experiences, or they can give you some of the worst, like in Rain World for me, some of the random things that can happen, just like it's like starts off a chain of events which leads to you being miserable. It's a very tight line to balance and a hard thing to ensure that when you do this in your game, you always create a more positive experience in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, but to me that's like that's interesting, right? Like
Yeah.
if you're in a situation in a Resident Evil game where you're down to 2 bullets, you have to figure shit out. You're like, oh my God, what am I going to do? How am I going to get around this problem? And as long as it is possible to get around that problem, then it's okay. It's a bad situation when there's literally no options available to you, though. I agree. And Rain World does do a thing where sometimes you die through no fault of your own.
I've got an example of this that I would cite as bad.
Yeah,
So in Super Smash Bros. Brawl, there is this mechanic, random tripping, which will make your character trip over randomly occasionally and basically get stunned.
that's so
Um,
weird.
and it makes it so sometimes newer players beat better players. Would you describe that as like, this thing where you have to deal with this stuff happening randomly, and if you get through it, it's better? Like, I think that mechanic's like one of the worst in a video game ever, but it sort of lines up with this concept you're describing.
It's
Like, I think,
interesting. Like Pokemon does a similar thing with critical hits, right? Where critical hits in competitive Pokemon are a thing, and there are all kinds of random percentage chance things in Pokemon, like flinch chance and everything. And to some degree, it's accepted that mitigating variance is a part of the gameplay there. Having a random trip chance, I mean, I don't know to what degree you're able to mitigate that variance, so
no, it
it
just
sounds
happens.
less enjoyable. I would say
Yeah.
that variances can be interesting when there are ways to deal with it in a meaningful way.
Yeah, which I thought Resi 1 does. Like, when you're low on resources, you can still get through the game. Like,
Absolutely. You barely need to fight anything in that game, right?
yeah, so I agree with caveats.
Yeah, you can't say anything straight up ever. But as long as you're giving tools to mitigate variance is acceptable.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a bit of a tangent, but we will see you next episode for Resident Evil 2.
See you then, guys.